People have been making stuff up for as long as people have existed. This video is going to cover some of the most influential mythical figures in human history. It's important to note that most of the figures that I'm naming come from a period of time far in the past, when no one could prove the storyteller that they were wrong. No one could really call them out on their BS. As history continued, myths morphed into legends, and legends morphed into history. And while it's easy to pass off mythology as just a bunch of bullshit from a time of greater ignorance, there is also a beauty to the BS. These stories were passed down through the oral tradition and then later on merged into writing, changing over time and place. They are a way for people to carve out their society's place in the world. They exist in virtually every culture and have had a profound impact on the societies who told them, oftentimes resulting in fictional characters that in many ways have had a greater impact on the real world than actual real people. So, let's start off with quite possibly the first great fictional character ever written about of time, and that is Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in human history, hailing from the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk in what is now Iraq. The tale stars King Gilgamesh, who had a bad habit of banging other men's wives before they got married. And this habit of turning everyone in his city into a cuck pretty much meant that they would revolt against him and kick him out. He would eventually encounter another major character, Enkidu, the Wild Man, in what was supposed to be an epic fight, but they eventually evolved to become friends, and the tale pretty much becomes a bro adventure. The story is rather incomplete given how old it is, but the themes of the story covers matters of life and death and morality, immorality, and the distinction between civilization and the wilds. Life and death is a pretty straightforward universal theme among all civilizations, but the emphasis on the distinction between civilization itself and the wilds could not have been more essential for the first city dwellers in human history. Next on the list is Anubis, the god of burial depicted with the head of a jackal because jackals were oftentimes found near ancient Egyptian burial sites. Given that most of ancient Egypt had a deep fascination with death and burial, I would argue that he most likely encapsulates the civilization who worshipped him best, even better than more prominent gods. But there's one other ancient Egyptian god that I think is even more unique than Anubis, and that would be Aten, the one true god. He was the first monotheistic god, predating any written records of the biblical god. Pharaoh Akhenaten did away with other Egyptian gods and declared this one sun disk in the sky to be the true creator of the world. However, after Akhenaten's death, monotheism quickly ran out of favor, and they would return to worshipping the traditional gods of Egypt. However, this would set up a pattern that would lead to the Israelites adopting their own brand of monotheism, which would later inspire Christianity and Islam. Speaking of the Bible, let's get on to Adam and Eve. Now, while our understanding of biology today makes the belief in a literal Adam and Eve untenable, the story of the first man and first woman found in many cosmologies in the world are quite compelling, and Adam and Eve just so happen to be the most famous. On top of that, it comes along with the story of a man and woman's fall from grace. Many ancient cultures believed in a former golden age, which is quite different than our modern view, which tends to view the future more optimistically in an age of progression. While the literal Adam and Eve aren't verifiable, scientists do believe in a scientific Adam and Eve. In biology, this is based upon tracing back a Y chromosome from the male lineage and the mitochondrial DNA of the female lineage, even though these two figures did not meet each other, let alone have a relationship. So I guess in a way, the mythology did have some element of truth. There was sort of kind of an Adam and Eve, but I doubt they actually talked to a snake. And of course, we have to include their two first sons on the list, Cain and Abel, which is the second story of the Bible. Cain became a farmer and Abel became a shepherd, and keep in mind this was after they had left the Garden of Eden. When asked to give God a sacrifice, Cain gave rotting crops, while Abel gave his newborn lamb and threw it into the fire. God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. Now, I personally would rather not have an innocent baby lamb be thrown into a pit of fire, but I'm not God, so who cares what I think? Cain, being jealous of Abel's superior sacrifice, eventually killed him. And this exemplifies the conflict between settled peoples who farm and nomadic peoples who herd. And this dynamic and conflict would dominate history up until very recently. Another very famous early biblical figure who needs no introduction is, you guessed it, Noah. There are plenty of great deluge stories around Mesopotamia during the time of the Bronze Age and Iron Ages. And while the literal story of an old man who managed to rescue 2 of each animal, including one of every 400,000 species of beetles, is probably BS, there probably is some element of truth behind these stories. The origin of these stories probably is inspired by a lot of significant river floods that were caused by the fairly unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Fertile Crescent. But let's move on eastward to Yu the Engineer in China. After all, I was just talking about rivers and floods. Chinese civilization also started on the banks of rivers. This is why one of the greatest fictional kings is Yu the Engineer, who led construction projects and infrastructure projects to prevent excess flooding, while still using the water to feed the crops, or, well, water the crops. While Yu probably didn't exist literally, he probably was based off of some king who started some sort of flood control projects, who would eventually turn into a legend. What I find quite interesting is that this original Chinese folk hero was not a warrior who slayed some monster, but rather a proto-civil engineer. Next on the list is also from China, but a little bit different, and that would be the Yellow Emperor, a truly mythological figure, who real Chinese emperors and their subjects looked up to. As a way of hearkening back to some glorious past, this guy apparently invented writing, calendars, or a variety of other products, maybe even Temu. He became very popular in ancient China's golden age during the Han Dynasty. The Chinese political system was based off of the mandate of heaven. In other words, a dynasty would only be in power under the good graces of the gods, and if they were unjust or incompetent, the gods would get rid of them, and would be replacing them with another dynasty. The Han used this tale to overthrow the first imperial dynasty of China, the Qin, which were notorious for their excesses of authoritarianism and brutality. The next person on this list is actually fairly obscure to anybody who didn't grow up in a Buddhist setting. And be warned, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but I'm going to try anyway. Maitreya, the future Buddha and the successor of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. This figure will return and bring an era of social and moral enlightenment after a long period of social and moral decay. Many have noticed the parallels between the Buddhist teachings and the second coming of Christ in this regards. And that leads us to another figure, Sakra, the defender of Buddhist heaven. While Buddhism is sometimes considered to be atheistic or the very least apatheistic, meaning that it doesn't care about the existence of gods, there are some variations of Buddhism that place a great deal of emphasis on mighty supernatural beings, namely in Mahayana Buddhism. Most Westerners typically think of Theravada Buddhism from Southeast Asia, and Mahayana Buddhism tends to have a lot more of these sort of supernatural figures. Nonetheless, Sakura does appear in the Theravada Pali Canon as well. Let's go back to the Middle East, which you guys are probably a little bit more familiar with in terms of their stories. Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael. You're probably familiar with these patriarchs. Abraham was said to have lived in ancient Mesopotamia in the city of Ur, not too far off from Gilgamesh's city of Uruk. He was told by God that his descendants would become the chosen people and would be promised their own land and a covenant. He tried to have a son with his wife/sister Sarah. Maury Povich didn't exist at the time to bring him onto their show. But alas, this initially failed. He did have a son with his Egyptian slave, Hagar. This son would be known as Ishmael. God blessed Abe and Sarah eventually, and finally they were able to have a son by the name of Isaac. The most famous story involves God telling Abe to sacrifice Isaac to him, but at the last minute, God's like, dude, I was just trolling you. You don't need to kill your son. God was impressed with Abraham's loyalty. So, as a result of this, he would move on to bless Abe and Isaac. Now, this was probably pretty traumatizing for Isaac, and Child Protective Services didn't exist at the time. Nonetheless, Isaac was quite successful. He would have his own son Jacob, who would have 12 sons, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel and Judea by lineage. The two of Judea would become the foundations of the Jewish people today. Later on, the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in what is now Saudi Arabia, would claim to be the descendant of Ishmael, and Ishmael was the father of the Arab people, hence why Islam is also an Abrahamic religion. Next on the list is someone you probably have not heard of, but has inspired a lot of the pop culture that you're familiar with, Ahura Mazda, the creator god and celestial dad of Zoroastrianism, a dualistic religion from what is now Iran, and would become the religion of the First Persian Empire, and would have a significant degree on Abrahamic religions. This religion placed the concept of good and evil on the map. And while being regarded as simplistic today, the worship of this deity did help promote policies in the Persian Empire that were considered more just and less indiscriminate than some of the more bloodthirsty Mesopotamian empires of the past. This good deity would eventually destroy the evil deity towards the end of time. And it's inspired everything from the band Queen to Star Wars to the Red God of Game of Thrones. Let's move on to quite possibly the most iconic mythological figure of all, Zeus, the sky god and god of the Olympians. Despite being violent, petty, and having a long list of accusations that would shock Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, the Greeks still worshipped him, and in turn, that inspired the Romans to worship a version of him called Jupiter. Today, his name is almost synonymous with ancient mythology, and is arguably the most famous and influential mythological figure in the Western world. So I don't want to dwell too much on him, so I'm going to move on to another figure from Greek mythology, Prometheus. If you didn't know how much of a scumbag Zeus was, then you gotta look up the story of Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan with the power of foresight. He was able to see into the future, which gave him intel that the titans, of which he was a part of, led by Kronos, would eventually be defeated at the hands of the Olympian gods, led by Kronos' son Zeus. For this reason, he stayed neutral during the war, and as a result was spared by the gods of Olympus. However, he did later anger Zeus by giving fire to the humans, which allowed civilization to begin. Zeus hated this, and along with a practical joke played on Zeus, chained Prometheus to a rock, and he had his liver eaten by a hawk, only to regrow and then be eaten every day by day, living eternity in excruciating pain. But nonetheless, the Greeks loved Prometheus for his self-sacrifice, and all the pain that he has endured and continues to endure for the betterment of humanity. Now, still keeping on with the Greeks, we get to Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War. We know that Troy existed, but we don't know whether or not there was an actual war. If there was an actual war, it probably had less to do with two guys fighting over who to bang Helen of Troy, or a beef between Apollo and Zeus, but rather access to maritime trade routes. Nonetheless, Homer placed a mythological figure of Achilles at the center of the story, defeating the Trojan Hector in a battle, before being killed by a shot to the heel by Hector's brother, Paris. These stories were set up during the Mycenaean Age, a time that was ancient even in accordance to the perspective of people living during the Golden Age of Athens. The story gave Greeks, who were living at the time in quarreling and warring city-states, a sense of shared identity, a shared history, that would later be utilized to defend themselves against the Persians. Alexander the Great would later even visit the supposed tomb of Achilles. The second most famous hero of the Greeks during the Trojan War is probably Odysseus, who embarked on a voyage back home after the Trojan War called the Odyssey, also written by Homer. Granted, some historians actually think that the Odyssey was written by a different author, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, Odysseus fell out of favor with the sea god Poseidon. He went on a long trek of trials and tribulations that resulted in the death of all of his crew before finally returning home several years later. The story is pretty much the ancient world's greatest spin-off series. The Odyssey was a spin-off series of the Iliad, however, there was also fan fiction. And that fan fiction of the Trojan War was the Aeneid, centering around Aeneas, who was supposedly one of the survivors of the Trojan War, and obviously was from the city of Troy, who led some of the survivors out of what is now Anatolia and modern-day Turkey to sail around the Mediterranean, eventually landing in the Italian peninsula. His descendants, Romulus and Remus, would found the city of Rome, according to the myth. Now, before he arrived in the Italian peninsula, he actually stopped by Carthage, in which he had a brief love spat with Dido, the Phoenician princess from the state of Tyre, or the city-state of Tyre, who fled her homeland after a power squabble between her brother and husband. She eventually would supposedly set up the foundations of Carthage in what are Tunisia in North Africa. The breakup of these two figures was pretty rough, and it would set the foundations for the conflict between Rome and Carthage, at least in the literary sense, but not necessarily in the historical sense. Later on, Romulus and Remus, the descendants of Aeneas, would be abandoned as babies, but survive due to a she-wolf named Lupa, which literally means she-wolf. She suckled them, more proof that dogs are better than humans. Romulus, however, killed Remus, his own brother, hence why we call Rome Rome and not Rheme, or whatever it would have been called had Remus taken over. Romulus would invite criminals to his settlement, and then they would kidnap some Sabian woman, setting up the demographic basis for the city. Which is quite unusual given the fact that the Romans portrayed a very poor picture of themselves in the past, unlike most people. So next on the list is really a group of people. It's pretty much any character in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, and I'm mispronouncing it terribly, by the way. This is one of the greatest epics of the Indian subcontinent, and it has a page count that makes the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid combined look like a tweet. The most famous verse is the Bhagavad Gita, which outlines an epic discussion between Krishna, an avatar, the Hindu preserver god, and the prince that he was helping, which covers a wide variety of topics and subjects such as ethics, how to fight just wars, metaphysics, and cosmology. I can't even scratch the air that covers the surface of how incredibly complex and epic this narrative is. What I will mention is that these stories trace their origins to the Indo-Aryan migration into the Indian subcontinent and the emergence of Hinduism, a mixing of Indo-Aryan, Dravidian, and Harappan culture into one of the most colorful and mysterious civilizational foundations in history. Next on the list are a group of mythological figures you've almost certainly heard of: Odin, Thor, and Loki. Indo-Europeans with their horses, wheeled carts, and language would also migrate in another direction, Europe. This laid the foundation of most European languages. Proto-Indo-European is the foundation of most European languages alongside Sanskrit, Hindi, and Farsi in the East. But it wasn't just the languages, it was sometimes the stories from those languages that would have similar parallels. Those gods not only include the aforementioned Greek gods, but also the Germanic gods. Today we usually associate these Germanic gods with Norse people or the Vikings. However, these gods were very popular among other Germanic groups, such as the Angles and Saxons. It's just that the Vikings were the last to adopt Christianity. Nonetheless, the rough and tough Germanic mythology of Odin, or Woden, depending on its various regional manifestations, would emerge, and would be intermixed with Celtic, Roman, and Judeo-Christian stories. A lot of people don't know that the words we use for weeks oftentimes come from these gods. Thursday traces back to Thor's day, and Wednesday from Woden's day. Woden, or Odin, probably had some influence on Santa Claus, mixing his mythological tales with those of, say, St. Nicholas, into Father's Christmas and Sinterklaas, which eventually became Santa Claus. And of course, Thor, Odin, and Loki have become very popular figures in modern pop culture due to the Marvel movies. Next on the list, and really the last one on the list, is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of the Aztec priests. While records of pre-Columbian Americas are hard to come by, far more so than those of the Old World, Quetzalcoatl was arguably the most influential deity of Mesoamerica before the Spanish took over. Even the Mayans, who were at a great distance south of the Aztecs, had their own versions of him. When the Spanish took over Mesopotamia, thus creating Mexico, there was a cultural synergy between Catholic and Aztec practices. Quetzalcoatl, while no longer worshipped directly, would have certain elements of his story incorporated into new stories that combined Catholic and Hispanic themes. And there you have it. That's my list of some of the most influential mythological figures in human history. If you have ones that you thought I missed, and there are plenty of them, please name them and maybe give us a few facts about them. Thanks for watching. Bye.